Okay. So welcome back. Good afternoon. Well, I guess it's almost afternoon. So what we're going to do in the next 30 to 40 minutes is that I'll make a quick presentation standing in for the bright research team that is on my right. You can look upon me as a bit of an imposter, but I'll make the presentation and they'll address the questions. And then Helani will make a presentation on Sri Lanka and Myanmar, right? And they'll address the questions. And they'll address the questions. And the report is going to be available. It's not available right now, but there's a PowerPoint available. Based on, as I said in the morning, we get the feedback from all of you, will refine the report, and then it will be available. And perhaps there's an intention to integrate the findings not only for India, but on the cards is an integration of the report for South Asia as a whole to draw some lessons, as Krishnan was saying, for policymakers in the future. So this is what I'm going to do, is the agenda is setting the context. A lot of this has already been sort of highlighted and discussed. I'll take you through this once more. There'll be some repetition, not a whole lot. So the labor market is, since we are talking about employment, informal employment between, and using platforms to pairing talent between demanders and suppliers. So the focus is on the labor market and how the transformation in the labor market is going to happen. And we know, as I had said in the morning as well, the labor market in India is going through some amount of change and churn. What it's been in the past and what it will be in the future are perhaps completely different. There are stylized facts about employment in India. It's dominated by agriculture, despite agriculture having just 15% of the GDP, contributing about 50% of livelihoods and employment, clearly pointing to the fact that it's highly unproductive, and therefore there will be movement out of agriculture. Manufacturing has been sort of stagnant at about 17% in the last decade, hasn't been labor intensive as compared to China and Korea before us. And one of the other stylized facts of the Indian market, and most of you would be familiar with this, is the fact that even the labor intensive industries in India have been actually capital intensive. So traditionally what you thought as textiles, toys, apparel, garments, etc., which were traditionally labor intensive, in India have been relatively more capital intensive compared to countries that kind of became competitive in these industries, with the result that you have had the employment or jobless growth, as they call it, has been a kind of a dominant narrative in India. Alongside with that, there's been a growing informalization or contractualization of the labor force. I don't want to eulogize this, but there is, in a sense, the informalization of the sector, where 90% of Indians work in the informal sector, in some sense has been one of the manifestations of our structural transformation, whether it's the labor laws, whether it's whatever, the inspector Raj that has been dominant, but definitely the outcome has been an informalization of the workforce. And of late, there's been, as Krishnan was referring to this, there's been a decline in female labor force participation rate, which raises questions, both sort of issues of positive as well as negative. Positive because maybe they're going back to school and education. Negative because there's a bias against women in the workforce. So these are, in a sense, the stylized facts about the Indian labor market. Very informal, protection available to the very few, which means social security benefits available to less than 10% of the population, and the inability to create mass employment due to the manufacturing sector. The other sort of transformation that is now happening, so if you look at that in the background and then impose the internet on this, and what the internet and the rise of the internet is doing is, of course, it's transforming completely the opportunities available in this sector. And what we do is we haven't looked at specific industries, and Krishnan was mentioning some industries where automation is destroying jobs, and the potential to destroy jobs is very high, but at the same time, because of the lower wages, that sort of damage to jobs may not be as high in India as in the rest of the world. The narrative in India will be different because of the labor cost, but these are some of the industries and Krishnan referred to one of them, where this transformation is likely to be most disruptive. And, India is also now home to one of the largest, I think it's the third largest country, if I'm not wrong, in terms of number of startups. And the number is close to 5,000. I think of 4,700 if memory serves me right, but largest number of startups coming into the country. One of the things that you would all recall, if you look at unemployment rates in India, judged by the unemployment surveys, although they come up with a lag, the number that you get is 4%, 5%, that's the unemployment rate in India. Which means that one shouldn't be worried about unemployment. I mean, in this, it's very low. It's what the mature country economists would call the frictional rate of unemployment, which is consistent with full employment in the sense that at any point in time you would have 5% of the people switching or moving between jobs, and therefore 5% is relatively acceptable and it's fine. But a problem here is that the poverty levels are so high and you've got so much of unproductive and informal employment that it actually underestimates the amount of underemployment that exists in the Indian economy. So, and to use a cliche, Indians cannot afford to be poor. They need to work to be able to make ends meet. So these are, in this background, I'll quickly take you, so that's the background of the labor markets. I'll quickly take you through, since we're going to talk about the digital economy, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but one of the most visible sort of changes in the Indian digital scenario has been the enormous sort of competition that has occurred in the telecom sector after liberalization. And I won't belabor this, but we have huge competition, and hopefully, that level of competitiveness that exists in our telecom sector with outcomes in terms of very low voice costs, etc. Hopefully that competition, if not in numbers, at least in outcomes, will show up in the rest of the digital economy, which hasn't yet. So the rest of the digital economy is dominated by a few players, and I guess winner take all happens in the digital space. So one may not see in terms of numbers the kind of competition that we've seen in telecom. Telecom, of course, has been seen both in terms of outcome and in terms of numbers. We've seen a lot of competition. But in the digital space, you'll probably see competition, but or outcomes of competition, but not in numbers. So I'll leave you to look at these numbers later on. They are available in the packet, and the slides that we've distributed to you in the packet. But one of the things that stands out is that Google continues to be dominant in India. Social media, Facebook continues to be dominant. So some platforms are dominant in terms of market share. But in terms of competition issues, I leave that the jury is still out on whether they are abusing this level of dominance or not. So what, as Helani was saying in the morning, what we started out to do in this project is to look at the market for online outsourcing. And online outsourcing really, you'd see that when India became a world beater in the BPOs, at least in the low-end BPO industry, we were providing these services, and Helani had also mentioned Mode 4 in the morning. That was really the beginning of India's entry into this space, and India became competitive in this space. There were pioneers who got the outsourcing model right, and India served the rest of the world. And Krishnan also referred to the data set, which I'm going to show you. So essentially, online, outsourcing has been around for a long time. In India, the BPO is a manifestation of outsourcing. Online outsourcing, given that we have digital platforms now which are becoming more mature, is gaining ground. And the reason it's gaining ground is because of obvious reasons, is because it reduces the transactions costs of delivering the service. And there's a definition of online outsourcing that I would come to very quickly, and then I'll go back. So if you look at online freelancing or online outsourcing, you'd suppose you say that I'm worried, or if not worried, I'm interested in how the job is sourced, how it's completed, and how it's delivered. Now, classical online freelancing or classical outsourcing would be that all three are delivered online. I mean, that would be really the classical, if you were to draw a comparison between what economists call public goods. What's the classic public good? It's both non-excludable and non-rival. And this would be similar. It's, what is classical outsourcing online? It's everything is done online. Source, delivery, as well as completed. But given, and what you will see during the course of the presentation, in India, given the deficiencies of infrastructure, given the deficiencies of I said skill sets, you could have different models. I mean, there are variations of a theme. It's not completely different. And we've got 4 types of models. So you could have it sourced online, completed online, and delivered online, which is the top left-hand quadrant. And then you could have, I said, variations of the theme. And we consider for this study the entire set. So it's sourced online, completed online, delivered offline, sourced online, completed offline, delivered online, and sourced online, completed offline, and delivered offline. We look at all 4, but as I said, the classical online outsourcing would be the top left-hand quadrant. And but what is common in all 4 is that the source of the job or the source of the information is online. Okay, so we interacted with online platforms, and sorry, I'm going down, I should go back up. So what are the research questions that we identify? And just to motivate the discussion, I won't go through each slide, but those of you who recall the sort of, and I think this is sort of good as a background to consider is if you look at the transactions costs in an online platform, and they greatly get reduced. And those of you who recall the 1930s brilliant article by Ronald Coase, who talked about the theory of the firm, how big is a firm, how small is a firm, it depends on the nature of largely the transactions costs. So the higher the transactions cost, the more sort of likelihood or probability that you will internalize those transactions within a firm, because making transactions outside the firm became sort of high, and therefore you want to internalize those transactions. And the result was a seminal paper which resulted in a Nobel Prize in 1936, I think, the theory of the firm, along with the theory of social cost. And now if you look at that background and look what online outsourcing or what online freelancing is doing, it's basically reducing your transactions costs in terms of search costs, in terms of delivery costs. And I think this digital platform is only going to become more and more pervasive. So I think that's the background which, if you were to link it to existence and size of firms, that's what one should keep in mind. I've already talked about this, so I'll go straight to our research objectives. So the research objectives were to look at the existing business models for microwork and online freelancing. The difference between, I'm a little fuzzy right now, the difference between online freelancing and microwork, but what I understand is that microwork is really a subset, a smaller, less scaled version of online freelancing, but we'll obviously have better explanations for you during the question and answer session. So we're going to look at the existing models of microwork and online freelancing. And we're going to look at profile of microworkers and freelancing. And I'm going to take the liberty of comparing our results with, if I have time, with some results that are coming out from the United States, where the context, as Krishnan was saying in the morning, as Helani was saying, the contexts are different. But interestingly, there is, there are some relative preferences to flexibility. And what online and microwork allows, of course, is flexibility. And so what are the preferences towards flexibility in the Indian context and in the US context? Some early comparison. I don't think we should make much of that, but I'm going to try and draw some comparisons with research that is coming out of the United States. And then what are the challenges and perceptions related to online freelancing and microwork in India? And I think perceptions are very important. Of course, preferences are important, and perceptions are also very important. And there are some sort of intuitive findings that our research throws up. But before I get into the Indian results and the design of our sample, I mean, there's no design of the sample, it was a purposive sample, so there's no real sample design. But before I get into that, this is what Krishnan was quoting. And what you see here is really India's dominance in the delivery of services online. And India occupies 24% of all workers are Indian workers, what they call I-labor. So it's not a small amount. I don't know the numbers in terms of absolute numbers. I don't know if we have numbers for that. But 24% of the global market is not a small amount. And as you notice, the nature of services that are delivered of this is what also Krishnan referred to, are software development and technology is very large. Sales and marketing support is very large. And the third one is the orange, sales and marketing support, and creative and media. So those are the three large services that are delivered by Indians in the global market, and India being the largest in the global market. And there's a study by Ejaz Ghani, and some of you know him, finds that, when I read this, it kind of sounded like, what the Chinese have often talked about, FDI. A lot of Chinese FDI is actually Chinese in origin, a lot of money that is coming back to China through Hong Kong and Macau. And that's what I was reminded when I read this kind of result, which is that the Indian diaspora, outsources this work to Indians, which also adds to, I don't know what the exact amounts are, but yeah. Okay. So there was a list of, we created a list of 50 firms that belong to the online freelancing and microwork sector, and I think the team went and interviewed them, and the results are there. I'm not going to kind of go through each of the detailed results, but the list is fairly exhaustive, and it covers both in terms of scope and in terms of nature of the freelancers. And the questions that were asked were, what is the objective, what is the type of organization, what is the task complexity, what is the skill applicable to the sector, what is the revenue model, essentially, and the target user group. So we had, structured sort of questions which were asked in a focus group sort of discussion to these firms. So there are various types of platforms that exist, both in terms of freelancing platforms and microwork platforms. There are platforms like Upwork and TrueLancer, which support a very wide network of freelancers and clients across a range of skills. And there are relatively new ones called Flexingit, Crookster, Gaia. And then there are targeted platforms that target women, sheroes, jobs for her, or people with disability. So you have these platforms that vary both in terms of range and quality of the skills that they support. And included in this list of 18 firms that were interviewed were also these 5 rural BPOs, which have been around for a while: Desi Crew, Harva, Data Halli, Vindhya, and Indivillage. And each of these organizations provide training to their employees, and the level in the microwork platform, I understand the level of the skill required is fairly at a low level. So the low level of skills. What are the sort of learnings from our initial interactions with these firms or with these platforms? And I think a couple of things stand out, and those in the first 2 bullets that you look at, that the potential is huge. According to the people that we interviewed, they say that 70 to 80% of jobs in the economy could be potentially outsourced. I mean, that's a staggering number, and it's also a frightening number at the same time. If all these jobs could be outsourced, the potential is very high. Of course, with the Internet of Things and 5G coming, it may not be an unrealistic number to assume, but it is a fairly large number. And the second interesting, and this I think is going to resonate through not only the one-on-one interviews, but also in the other sort of structured questionnaire interaction with freelancers, both students and non-students, is that what is the perception accorded to these people? I mean, what is the nature of the job? Is this a job a first choice job? Is it a second choice job? Is it regarded as a permanent job? And that perception is not very positive. So it is considered a second-grade job to individuals with permanent jobs in Indian society. And those of you who have kind of, and I want to bring this point here, and I think it's an important point given the transition that we are going through, is that in India, there has been, especially at the low-level jobs, and you've probably experienced this in your own sort of backyards, as it were, which is that there is a huge preference, and not a preference, an obsession at the lower end of the spectrum for government jobs, as opposed to private sector jobs. And I've talked to Krishnan about this in the past, is that people, even coming out of the ITIs, who can potentially get private sector jobs, they would do that job and then go back and write a government exam and hopefully get into government service. There seems to be an obsession. And that obsession, I think, stems from the fact, of course, apart from the fact that we are emerging from a relatively feudal society and things, often institutions are sclerotic. In fact, they take a long time to change. But that is the idea of permanency seems to be ingrained in the people. And therefore, I think online outsourcing or freelancing has to battle with that existing prejudice that exists in our mind, especially our parents' mind. I don't know whether when the youngsters become parents, maybe they won't have, maybe that behavior would have shifted. But at least in my parents' mind or people of that generation, would certainly regard a government job as a permanent job to be a first-rate job and all others to be second-rate. And definitely, temporary, transitory positions with low levels of incomes would be considered an inferior job and done as a sort of a last resort or a second resort or a third resort. So I think that is an important result, and it comes as no surprise of the survey. And the rest, I think, are, and I'll quote an American study that when I talk about the results of the structured questionnaire that we did on SurveyMonkey, but I think this is one interesting comparison that we wish to bring out. Of course, platforms need to innovate on payment, and Krishnan talked about this, and Helani also talked about this. The belief that informal work is relatively unskilled work, also that challenge of perception also needs to be battled. And that, of course, also exists in our manufacturing sector. And I think sometimes unjustifiably so, because the contractual and informal workers do almost the same task or the same complexity of tasks as the formal protected workers in India's manufacturing sector. So informality sort of has a prejudice that is linked to it, and it will take some time to battle that. The second survey, so this is a survey result from interview with 18 of 50 purposely decided platforms, both online freelancers platforms as well as microwork platforms. And I think I've given you the two key takeaways, and I think, do you want to add something on the results? Is there anything that you would want to add on the results? Yes? Go ahead, please go ahead.
I'd just like to say that I think the perception also, like Sir spoke about, it also ties in with the policy understanding of informal and formal labors. And in any understanding in an understanding of labor policy and labor design, it's very important for us to now think about these distinctions between formal and informal labor, because like the obsession with government jobs, the obsession with private sector 9-to-5 jobs, the obsession with permanent jobs, these are largely created by policy-driven decisions to categorize labor as formal and informal. But a lot of value addition and a lot of means of livelihood are in fact coming from the informal sector. So I guess a need to rethink that. That's the
Absolutely, and that's one conclusion that we will draw from this, at least initial conclusion that we will draw from this study, and the need to sort of look at the gray areas between the formal sector and the informal sector, and how to sort of therefore make policy more responsive, and not necessarily call it informality. Okay, so the next survey was, so the survey was collected, the data was collected from almost 2,000 respondents. The survey was live for over 2 months on this tool, which is somehow, I don't know why, I don't know what the epistemology is, called Survey Monkey. And